what would you say are the foods significantly impacting people's mental health today so much that they should consider eliminating it completely from their diets?
The refined carbohydrates, sugars, flours, cereal products, fruit juices, refined vegetable oils, things like corn oil, sunflower oil, canola oil, all the refined seed oils, and I would argue even the grains, whether whole or not, should also go.
The nutritional orthodoxy, though, would disagree with you on many of those, right? Like grains are still considered a staple if you look at the My Plate paradigm, right? Vegetable oils are considered heart healthy even today. Where do you think this dissonance comes from? And why do you think that these are foods worth considering eliminating?
Well, there is no reason to consume them. There's no biological or nutritional reason to consume them. The reason why we're told that we need, well, let's take, for example, whole grains or grains of any kind. We're told that those should really form the lion's share of the bottom of the triangle if people think about the pyramid, the food pyramid, that we're supposed to really base our diet on starchy staples like grains and legumes, grains and beans. And the problem with that is that information doesn't come from clinical human experiments. It's not as though people who consume grains are healthier than people who don't consume grains. What's actually happening is there's been study after study showing that whole grains are healthier for us than refined grains. But that does not necessarily mean that whole grains are good for you. It just means that they're better for you than refined grains.
Yeah, I love that. It's like the question you always have to ask is compared to what when people
Yes.
are promoting diet, whether foods or supplements and the like,
Well, exactly. And if you step back from all of the questionnaire-based guesswork about, what we're supposed to eat, which is what most of the nutrition headlines and the nutrition guidelines that we have, absorbed into our psyches for, decades. If you step back from that questionnaire-based guesswork, and you actually look at what's inside of a grain and you ask yourself, well, why do I need to eat this? Why would this be good for me in the first place? Is there something that a grain is providing for me that I can't get somewhere else? And the answer is not only is there nothing there that you can't get somewhere else, but there are actually components inside grains that are risky to health. So grains, no matter how you look at them, if you're thinking biologically rather than epidemiologically, which is the guesswork part of things, if you're looking at them from the standpoint of nutritional components, they're all risk and no benefit.
Why does epidemiology, what is epidemiology? Like, what is that?
Yeah, so most of the nutrition research that is driving the confusing headlines about nutrition and also that is backing up most of our nutrition guidelines, things like, you need to eat a rainbow of fruits and vegetables. You need to eat healthy whole grains and legumes, that animal foods are risky and plant foods are healthier, that the more plant foods you eat, the better. All of these, saturated fat is bad for you, animal protein is dangerous. All of those things that we have been led to believe most of them come from this type of a study called a nutrition epidemiology study. And a nutrition epidemiology study is, it's completely unscientific. So what a nutrition epidemiologist does is they have an idea in their minds about how foods might be related to certain diseases. And so they will ask many, many, many people, sometimes tens of thousands of people, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. They'll administer these questionnaires, these what are called food frequency questionnaires. And these are questionnaires that will include questions such as, how many half-cup servings of blueberries have you eaten over the past year? Questions that are impossible to answer. So what they're doing with these questions is they're trying to get a sense of how people are eating, like what their dietary pattern looks like. What foods are they including? What foods are they excluding? And then they're going to take the answers to these questions, and they're going to look through these questions, through their answers for patterns to see if they can notice any connection between how many blueberries, whether or not the number of blueberries people report eating is related at all to whether or not they'll develop, say, dementia or memory problems, right? So these questionnaires at most usually contain maybe 130 questions, sometimes fewer. And they're really asking about people's dietary patterns over usually the past year or so. And they're all based on memory. I eat a very, very limited diet, and I couldn't tell you what I ate a week ago, let alone, over the past year. But it would be one thing if these questionnaires would allow people to give an honest answer. So, for example, if I ask you how many half-cup servings of blueberries you've eaten over the past year, and assuming they eat fruit, which I don't know if you do, then, what if you didn't know? Or what if you weren't sure? Or what if you couldn't remember? You're not allowed in these questionnaires to answer this way. You are forced to quantify. You are forced to give an answer that in half-cup servings, averaged over the course of the entire year. So the problem with that is that those wild guesses, and that's actually what they are, they're wild guesses. Those wild guesses they become the only data in that study. So, and that's not data. Data should be quantifiable. It should be measurable. Something you can measure. It should be concrete mathematical information. These are wild guesses. And to make things worse, as I was saying, the studies include, maybe 130 questions. There are thousands and thousands of products available in supermarkets, thousands and tens of thousands of ingredients. So we're only getting, even if these were reliable, even if people could remember accurately what they ate, we're only getting a picture of a small percentage of what they're eating. And so it doesn't actually represent what people are eating. And so then when you take that information and you look at whether or not people develop dementia or develop memory problems, you're trying to connect, okay, well, this group of people said that they, ate the most blueberries per year. And lo and behold, their memory, they did a little bit better on memory tests. Okay, well, first of all, how much better did they do? Only a little bit better. Second of all, the strength of the relationship between the amount of blueberries somebody is eating and the reduction in their cognitive scores, or the improvement in their cognitive scores, is really, really small. So these are called associations. So how much red meat this group of people reports eating, versus whether or not they develop cardiovascular disease, you might start to see some trends or some connections. What are called associations between how much somebody eats and whether or not they develop a particular disease. But these associations tend to be very, very small. And so in order for this guesswork type of questionnaire to be used as even a clue to a potential causal relationship between, say, blueberries and dementia or red meat and heart disease, the associations need to be very strong. You need to have at least twice the risk, say, of cardiovascular disease if you're eating more red meat than somebody who's reporting eating less red meat. But these associations are well below twice. They're well below 2. They're often just barely above 1. And if your association has a strength of 1, it is not an association at all. There's no relationship. So you're finding very, very weak relationships between foods and diseases, and then you're never testing your hypothesis. So you've got this theory, maybe red meat causes heart disease. So you question people about their red meat consumption, and then you find out whether or not they develop certain markers of heart disease. And so then you think, oh, wow, there seems to be a connection here. Then you publish that as a finding, but you haven't tested your hypothesis. It's just a hypothesis, just a guess. And so this is the problem. Science requires 2 phases. Scientific method. One is your hypothesis that you've observed in the environment. Oh, gee, maybe red meat causes heart disease. Let's ask these people how much red meat they ate. Let's see about their heart disease risk. And then the second part is supposed to be an experiment. You're supposed to test your hypothesis to see whether or not your ideas hold water. And nutrition epidemiologists do not conduct experiments of any kind. They stop at step 1 and they never go to step 2. The problem with this is you can then be wrong for decades about what you think causes disease, and you can publish hundreds of articles about that hypothesis. But what if you're wrong? You'll never know. And so these are completely unscientific. These are guesses about what causes. And so I have a whole chapter in the book about this type of science. And the reason I felt it was important to put a whole chapter in the book about this method is because this is the kind of science that forms the foundation for most of the nutrition beliefs we hold dear.
Wow. Yeah, it's fascinating. It's like it's observational, and these are the kinds of studies that form the foundation of our of our dietary guidelines, because there are precious few long-term randomized controlled trials in the field of nutrition where you put groups on various diets and you test them out over the lifespan of a group of individuals. Those kinds of studies largely don't exist. I mean, like, we can talk about the PrediMed study, which was just a 2-year study, and it had, there were lots of different variables that were changed in the different intervention groups. But I think what's so important about what you're saying is that the majority of information that we receive about how to eat healthily is based on these kinds of studies that are in no way powered to determine cause and effect, only relationships, which are meant to inspire further study.
And ultimately, I'm not even sure the relationships are valid. I'm not even sure the observations are valid because we don't have any data. I mean, a really good observational study, you'd be observing actual phenomenon in the universe, but we don't know how many pieces of red meat these people were eating. We don't know how many blueberries they were actually eating. We don't know how much of any food they were eating because nothing was ever measured. So this is the problem. And I know a lot of people say these associations are weak. They may not mean anything. And people in nutrition epidemiology would say, well, this is the best we can do because the experimental studies are so difficult to design and conduct and control and fund that nutrition epidemiologists will say, well, this is the best. This is the only way we have of looking at dietary patterns over long periods of time in large numbers of people. But, is a car that doesn't work better than no car at all? I mean, it's not science.
Yeah.
I think that this is really, really important for people to understand that they're placing their health, they're placing their faith in wild guesses. There's no science here whatsoever. And there's no logic either behind a lot of these hypotheses. When you look at what a whole grain contains, there's no reason to believe it would be good for you, let alone necessary in a healthy human diet. So it's baffling to me.
Yeah. No, it's so true. And these food frequency questionnaires, I mean, you address the problem with recall, right? Like, I can't remember what it is that I ate last week, let alone 6 months ago. But then also, I mean, what comes to mind is the most recent Harvard study linking red meat consumption to type 2 diabetes. And I remember on that food frequency, one of the critiques against the study was that under the umbrella of red meat, they put like lasagna and like, submarine sandwiches and things like that. So it's like, not only does memory falter and render these food frequency questionnaires unreliable, but it's like the way that foods are categorized are sometimes subject to incredible bias.
And that bias leads researchers to intentionally obscure, sort of, as you're saying, intentionally obscure even if the questionnaires were valid means of assessing a person's intake over the past year. If you lump meat in with bread or sauces or pasta or sugar, then you can't tell anymore what the relationship is between red meat and anything else because you've hopelessly obscured it by burying it in other types of foods. And this is a mistake, as you're pointing out, that happens all the time in nutrition epidemiology studies because for some reason, most people, not all, most scientists, most nutrition epidemiologists are biased against red meat in particular and animal foods in general. And it's very obvious when you look at the types of questions that they're asking and the types of hypotheses that they're testing.
And even when you see these associations, like for example, if you see red meat is associated with at the population level, right? And we have a very unhealthy population here in the United States, right? So it's like, the first question that should be asked always is like, what population are we looking at, right? Like you might see, an association between red meat consumption and poor health outcomes at the population level. But what about taking, people on like a self-described Paleolithic diet, or people that live in Los Angeles, or like people that live in, I don't know, like parts of the country that are affluent and they have access to pristine, high quality meat as opposed to like fast food meat, for example, But then you take these associations, like red meat associated with a 25% increased risk of, for example, type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease. They're typically reporting on relative risk. Mm-hmm. So even that 25% might seem scary. Like, I don't want to raise my risk for heart disease by 25%, right? But that's actually not absolute risk. Like a 25% increase in relative risk, if your absolute risk is 4%, you're seeing an increase go to 5%. And that's such a small increase that with all the other confounding variables in nutritional epidemiology, as much as scientists try to control for it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it would be silly to assume that that's a causal connection with such a tiny increase in risk.
Right. There's two problems. So one is the relative risk. So relative to what, right? So like you said before, compared to what? So if your risk starts out minuscule and you've raised it by 25%, it's just a little bit more than minuscule, right? So that matters. But the other thing that matters is the increase in risk of 25%. That number, 25%. Means that your risk has gone up. You would say the relative risk would be 1.25. So it's a little bit confusing, but let me back up a little bit here. So 25%, if in order for an epidemiology study, for an association that is detected in an epidemiological study to be meaningful, to be worth exploring further, to be potentially representative of a cause and effect relationship between two things, it has to be at least 100% higher.
So
double the risk,
yeah.
Right? So not a quarter higher, but a whole full 100% higher, right? So epidemiologists in other fields other than nutrition, respectable epidemiology representatives would laugh at an increase in risk of 25% and say, well, that's not even worth exploring. That is most likely to be a coincidence, not worth our attention. That it's very unlikely for there to be a cause and effect relationship between those two things that you've observed. So unless you see a 100% increase in risk or more, then you can pretty much dismiss it. And so, but even if you think that's important, you then should at least test it to see whether or not you're correct. But that doesn't happen. So this is the problem with nutrition epidemiology, is guesswork, weak associations, biased associations, meaningless associations. The associations may not even be real because we don't have any real data. That 25% increase in risk, as you were pointing out, may represent the risk of, may actually reflect all of the other things people were eating along with the red meat rather than the red meat itself. There's no way to know because the study wasn't conducted in a way that will allow us to answer this very important question.
Yeah. And skeptics say that, will say that epidemiology, they control for all of these different variables, these potential confounders like unhealthy lifestyle habits, smoking and the like, but they can't possibly control for all of it, right? Like the way that a person lives their life in their entirety. If somebody is a chronic fast food consumer, right? There's likely innumerable things that they're doing wrong, right? That are gonna contribute to that increase in risk.
Yeah, so one of the things that a lot of people say about nutrition epidemiology is that there's this healthy user bias, right? Because we're told red meat is bad for us, people who are more health conscious tend to eat less red meat. And so they're doing all kinds of other things that are healthier too. Maybe they're not smoking, maybe they're exercising, maybe they're more careful about the quality of the foods they're eating. They're not eating a lot of fried foods, or maybe they're cooking more at home, all these types of things. So that's an issue. But as you say, you can't control for all of these things. And why are we even trying? Because the core of the study is inherently useless. So you're taking useless guesses, and now you're manipulating all of that information to try to make it look more reputable or sort of more believable or more useful. But when the foundation of your study is a data-free zone, I mean, it doesn't matter to me how much you try to control for these things. I think the problem is there is no data to begin with. No data. And so that's not even step one of science.
Wow.
So these studies are wholly unscientific and completely unreliable. Oh, and we were talking about before that you need to have at least a 100% increase in risk in order to start to take an association seriously. We never see that in nutrition epidemiology. All of the associations are well below. We're talking well below 50%. We're talking usually well below 30%. So we're not getting anywhere close to meaningful level of association. And this is the public and journalists, they don't know this. I mean, people who write articles about about science and report on these studies are published. I mean, every week a new one comes out, right? They don't know. I mean, it's published in a reputable journal. It comes from usually very reputable institution. Usually the researchers are very well-known and influential researchers in the field. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people studied over sometimes 10, 20 years. It sounds like it should be important and worth reporting on, but it's not. Just because it's big and just because it comes from a really important institution doesn't mean that there's any meaningful information that you or your friends or your family or your loved ones could put their faith in to protect their health and well-being, which is what nutrition scientists should be caring about the most.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a corrupted, and I hate to say it because I love nutrition science, but it's such a corrupted field. And a lot of these nutrition researchers, they're not forthcoming about their own biases, and many of them, are either funded directly or their institutions are funded by these ultra-processed food companies, and it's sad. I mean, I think the best example is the most recent, the Netflix twin study. Yeah. That came out, which was led by a Stanford researcher who is, on paper, one of the most credible in the field, right? And but is a vegan essentially, and like a lot of their funding, especially with regard to the documentary, which had a very clear agenda that it seemingly was trying to push, was funded by these like fake these fake meat alternative companies, which are now, many of which are public at this point. And it is really sad. The other, I guess, recent example in recent memory was the food compass from Tufts, which for whatever reason seemed to think that, when you run, the tens of thousands of foods through the algorithm that they devised, Lucky Charms ended up being, appearing healthier than red meat, fake egg fried in a seed oil or something, whatever it was like healthier than a real poached egg. It's just shocking to me.
It is, and I think a lot of people, it's very, very common on social media for people to assume that I'm funded by the meat industry because I am sharing information about the fact that meat is good for you. Meat, seafood, poultry, animal foods are not just good for you. I think they're essential to an optimal human diet and critical to normal, healthy brain development during the first 1,000 days of life. When I say things like this, it happens pretty much every day that one or more people who are reading the article or listening to the interview will say, well, she's funded by the meat industry. Well, first of all, I don't know a single person in the meat industry. I haven't received a cent from the meat industry, either indirectly or directly. So it's patently false. But why don't people ask the opposite question? If someone is touting the importance of whole grains or plant-based diets or vegan diets, vegetarian diets, why aren't people asking the same questions of those individuals? I think it's a perfectly fair question, but it's often not asked of the same individuals. It's for some reason there is this assumption often made that, well, if you're saying something that's so different than what most people are saying, you must be saying it for financial gain rather than because you care about people's mental health, which I do. And the reason I wrote the book is because I care. There's so much that people can do who are worried about their mental health. You mentioned in the beginning, we have an epidemic of mental health problems of all kinds, great, small, and everything in between. In children, adolescents, adults, we have a tremendous amount of work to do to improve our mental health. And so, and the reason I wrote the book is because I want people to know who are worried about their mental health, which is now, if it's not you, then it's someone you love. I mean, it's that common. I want them to know that dietary changes can help them in ways no medicine can. Even help people recover, sometimes completely, from even very serious mental illnesses, sometimes in a matter of weeks. But you have to know which dietary changes are most worth making and why, and they are not the ones that we are accustomed to hearing about. They are, in many cases, exactly the opposite of the recommendations that we are getting. These recommendations that come from nutrition epidemiology, it's not just that they're useless, it's that they're harmful. These are standing in the way of our good mental health and our good physical health.
Wow, very powerful. Yeah, I mean, it's like avoid red meat, minimize, maybe have 1 to 2 servings of red meat, a small palm-sized serving of red meat per week, load up on the grains, prioritize polyunsaturated dominant, ultra-processed seed oils. It's a huge problem. I mean, I'm not like the biggest. I'll consume grains here and there in moderation, but I completely agree that there's nothing essential in grains, But on the other hand, it does seem like the same way that epidemiology, it's very easy to find links at the population level, however weak, between red meat consumption and poor health outcomes. It's just as easy to find grains, whole grains in particular, presented in a more favorable light. And I've always thought, an example that I've always used, and I'd be curious to hear your take on this. I've never actually looked into the literature on this, but I would bet that if you were to look at the population level to study all of the people who regularly eat quinoa, a grain that most people can't even pronounce, right? You take a grain like quinoa and you associate that with health outcomes. I bet you that they're probably the healthiest people in the United States, people who regularly eat quinoa. But just to paint that to illustrate the example, it's not because quinoa is this magical food. It's a perfect illustration of healthy user bias at work. It's like people who are shopping who live in an area where quinoa is accessible, who are shopping in supermarkets where you can buy quinoa, who are aware of it and who know how to pronounce it. Probably are doing a lot good, in their diets and lifestyles.
It depends on what else they're eating. So you can eat. So I worked in college mental health for many years. So I worked at the Harvard University Health Services for 6 or 7 years. And then I worked at Smith College in Western Massachusetts for 5 years. And I worked with a lot of students who ate quinoa. And unfortunately, none of them were healthy. Now, a couple of problems with what I just said. So one is, of course, students who were coming to me were not all students. The students who were coming to see me, of course, were struggling with mental health. And so, of course, they weren't a representative sample of the student body. So, but many of them were eating quinoa. Many of them were eating what they would describe as a plant-based diet, which is a very slippery and vague term. But many of them were eating vegetarian and vegan diets. But none of them were eating a healthy vegetarian or vegan diet. Because all of them, I think I can say all of them, were eating the same ultra-processed foods that all of the other students were eating. They just weren't eating meat. So they're eating cereals and granola bars and, ice cream, could be coconut ice cream, could be tofu-based ice cream, didn't have to be dairy-based. They were eating all of the same, and the sweetened coffee drinks. They were eating all of the same processed, sugary foods loaded with vegetable oil and refined carbohydrates that all of the other students were eating. But because the messaging is, if you eat a vegan diet or a plant-based diet where you're going to make sure you're getting your whole grains or your quinoa, you're going to make sure you're eating nuts throughout the day, you're going to make sure you're eating, there'll be certain foods that that they would make sure that they were eating. But what wasn't emphasized, enough, and still isn't emphasized enough in the messaging about plant-based diets by nutrition authorities who recommend them, is the whole foods part, right? So if you look closely to, at statements made by nutrition influencers who recommend a vegan diet, or plant-based, I would say whole food plant-based diet. And it's really important, those first two words. Those are not the words that my students were using. They were under the impression that all they needed to do to be healthier was remove the animal foods. And that study has actually never been done. Every study that's ever been conducted, has not just removed animal foods from the diet. It has also manipulated multiple other aspects of the diet and lifestyle of the people so they take this much healthier, whole foods, vegan or vegetarian diet, coupled with many other improvements in lifestyle, such as not smoking, stress reduction. Let's remove almost all of the fat from the diet, included the vegetable oils. Let's make sure that you are eating low glycemic carbohydrates, no refined carbohydrates, no junk foods, no alcohol. Let's improve the health of this diet in as many ways as we possibly can, and remove the animal foods, and compare that to a junky diet that happens to contain meat. There are so many differences between those two dietary patterns. Of course, the whole food plant-based diet comes out ahead in most studies that are conducted like this. These are clinical trials. Yes, you will see health improvements in those people, but we have no idea. There's no way to know which aspect of the diet is responsible for those health improvements, because removing meat was not the only thing that the researchers did. So we have no idea whether, if all you do is remove the animal foods from your diet, if you're going to be healthier in any way. And I would be willing to bet that you wouldn't see any improvements there. Because when you remove all the animal foods from the diet, you then have to supplement in order to get your basic needs met. And if you're going to eat a vegan diet, you actually need to include some processed foods to be healthy, because you can't fortify a whole food. And you need fortified foods to meet all of your requirements on a vegan diet. So I know people will say, when they hear me say things that when I say vegan diets are not healthier, they will say, but what about this person, this athlete, or this actress, or this, this famous person who's healthy on a vegan diet? And I'll say, you can make a vegan diet relatively healthy. You can, but you have to plan it carefully. You have to supplement carefully. You have to do other things to keep yourself healthy. And the other thing that's really important about this is you can't be pregnant, breastfeeding, or growing.
Right.
Those are the ifs, ands, and buts about vegan diets that are not widely known. So the ifs, ands, and buts are, yes, a vegan diet may be safe, although not optimal, may be safe if you construct your diet primarily of nutritious whole foods, and you supplement very carefully, but not if you are pregnant, breastfeeding, or still growing.
Well, I'd throw in two more wrenches. One is that a lot of these people seem to do better when adopting even a whole foods plant-based diet in the short term. We don't know how they fare over the long term.
Correct.
Right. And the other issue is that people talk about omnivore diets that are meat inclusive as having risks, right? But nobody ever talks about the risks incurred for somebody who is on a plant-based diet. The decline in bone mineral density, right? The decline in mental health, which you're an expert in, right? Like, there's all these risks that nobody seems to be talking about. The decline in fertility. There's so many people, the advocates for this diet are not forthcoming with the risks. And you see a lot of people on social media that seem to thrive on the diet. And, I'm not doubting that they are in fact thriving, but those people also tend to be obsessed with their diets, right? So when you hear like messaging from the food industry or through mainstream media that we're all better suited on these like plant-based diets, I think it does a huge public disservice, because most people are not going to be obsessed with their diets to the point that they're going to be making sure that they're getting adequate protein every day, that they're going to be looking at their vitamin B12 levels, that they're going to be supplementing with all of these other nutrients that we know are supportive for somebody on a plant-based diet, like creatine. Like, you think your average person who's watching the Dr. Oz show and hears that, like, oh, maybe I should give this diet a try, is going to start supplementing with creatine? Like, I highly doubt it.
Exactly. It takes a lot of knowledge. It takes a lot of planning. It takes access to the right foods. It takes effort. And as you were rightly saying, people who recommend, particularly nutrition professionals, nutrition scientists, nutrition institutions, who are explicitly recommending so-called plant-based diets, again, a term that's very, very slippery, means lots of different things to lots of different people. But let me be more specific. Vegetarian and vegan diets, particularly vegan diets, they are often downplaying, dismissing, or ignoring the very real risks of these diets and all of the special things you need to do to meet your nutrient requirements. So when you read papers, or even you may be familiar with the Eat Lancet study, which came out in 2019, which essentially recommended that a near vegan or vegan diet to everyone on the planet over age 2, as that's what was going to be healthy and sustainable. Their goal is to have this be the diet that the whole planet follows by 2050, for environmental reasons, maybe health reasons, lots of reasons. When you read that document, the Eat Lancet study, which was penned by Professor Walter Willett, who used to be, in charge of the head of the nutrition department at Harvard University. When you read that document, unless you read it very, very carefully, you're not going to catch all of those caveats, but they are all there. And if you read the references where they say, oh, meat is dangerous, and this is what's the problem with eggs, and this is the problem with saturated fat, and this is the problem with cholesterol, where they're saying that the reason they want people to avoid all of these animal foods is because they're so dangerous. When you actually look up those references, you don't find any real science there. And sometimes, on occasion, you will even find a reference that has nothing to do with the statement that was made. They know people aren't going to read these documents, but they make splashy headlines, and they impact they make a difference in how people eat. So people take these documents to heart. People who care about their health follow these recommendations, but the people who write these documents know, and you can tell by the way it's written, they know that the average person is not going to read this study. They write it in language that's very difficult to understand. They put in references that no one's going to look up, unless to me, I like to look these things up, or you. And when you find there's no information there to back up their recommendations. These documents are dangerous, and they're very influential. If we want to improve our mental health, we now have nearly 1 billion people on the planet with a mental health condition so serious that it's interfering with their ability to function. 1 in 5, including 1 in 5 of the world's children and adolescents. In the United States, almost 1 in 4 adults have a mental health disorder. And among young adults, 18 to 25, it's 1 in 3. This is our brains surely were not designed to disintegrate on this grand scale. I mean, this is what is happening. I mean, diet's not the only factor, but the fact that the quality of our diet has deteriorated so substantially over the past 50 to 75 years must have something to do with it. And particularly that now that 60% of what Americans are eating isn't food at all anymore. It's ultra processed ingredients and extracts and these garbage. And why would we expect our mental health to thrive if we're not feeding the brain properly? It'd be a miracle if we didn't have a mental health crisis on our hands. This is really tragic. And the information that we're getting is not helping us to move in a better direction. And if people had the right information, they could make better choices based on their priorities, You can do with the information what you want, but at least start with the right information. So that if you do care about your mental health and you are willing to make these changes, you can see dramatic improvements, again, in even very serious mental illnesses within a matter of weeks to months, without medication or with less medication, maybe without even having to start a medication in the first place. I mean, these are powerful strategies. Nutrition is powerful and important. That's why I write about it. That's why you write about it. People need to know. But if they don't have the right information, they're not going to see changes, and they're going to think, oh, well, diet doesn't matter. I sprinkled more superfoods on top of my diet. That didn't make a difference. Oh, I nibbled around the edges of my unhealthy diet and I took a couple of things out. Oh, that didn't seem to work either. You can't just nibble around the edges of an unhealthy diet. That's, in my opinion, what the Mediterranean diet does. Takes a few of the unhealthy things out, leaves most of the unhealthy things in, and has a kind of an upside down approach to nutrition. The foundation is wrong, and it should all be turned upside down. And you can't just sprinkle superfoods on top of an unhealthy diet. That strategy is completely useless. So people will give up, and they'll say, well, you know what? It doesn't really matter what I eat because I tried all those things and it didn't help. Well, you didn't try the most powerful interventions we have available. If you want real change to your mental health, you have to make real change to your diet. You have to fundamentally restructure your diet from the ground up. Then, and only then, will you see the kinds of results you need and want to see. And we're not talking subtle improvements. We're talking sometimes reversal of, complete recovery from, even sometimes decades of serious mental illnesses in people who've been taking multiple medications, who've been hospitalized multiple times. And we're seeing cases of complete recovery, not just anecdotes in people's practices, not just people's stories on social media, although these are very important, but we're seeing it also in the scientific research as well. We're starting to see mounting evidence supporting, for example, the use of a ketogenic diet, which energizes the brain in a completely different way from standard diets, and can repair and heal and the brain in ways that no other diet is really capable of doing. So, but if I recommend a ketogenic diet to my patients, the very first thing they're going to say is, well, what about all my fruits and my whole grains, and where am I going to get all these, my vitamins and minerals? And that's why I had to write the book, is because you don't need any of those things. That's not what matters. You don't need whole grains to be healthy. You don't need a rainbow of fruits and vegetables. There's nothing that exists in a fruit that you can't get from a non-starchy vegetable. There's nothing unique, nothing special or magical about fruit. Anything you're looking for in a fruit, you can find in a vegetable, and you can find it in a low carbohydrate vegetable. So, and there's nothing in a grain you can't get somewhere else. In fact, many things you don't want to have anyway.
Well, grains are mostly just starch, right? And there's maybe a little bit of like a small concentration of B vitamins, some insoluble fiber, but that's pretty much it, right? Do you think there's any value in the insoluble fiber? I mean, scraping out as an abrasive sort of broom in the digestive tract, or do you think it's not?
I'm going to answer both those questions. So the first piece was, is there any? So what's in a whole grain? And the problem with whole grains is that they're so nutrient poor that we have to fortify products made with grain in order to bring them up to snuff. You know what I mean? Have you ever seen a flour or a cereal that wasn't fortified with vitamins and minerals? They're fortified because if you look inside the grain, you're going to be very disappointed what you find in terms of its mineral and in terms of its nutrient content. So yes, it's primarily starch. So that's one issue. Some people deal with starch quite well, others don't. This depends on your metabolic health. So some people can tolerate a decent amount of carbohydrate in their diet. Some people can't anymore. Starch aside, we've got very few nutrients, and the nutrients that the grain does contain, let's say the minerals like iron or magnesium or zinc. Just because a plant food contains an essential nutrient doesn't mean you can access it. because plants protect their nutrients. And seeds, like grains are seeds, and they contain small embryos of, like say wheat or corn or rice. There's an embryo inside each one of those grains. Those nutrients are intended for that embryo, for that future plant. And so the plant very wisely protects those nutrients from your accessing it. So it's actually quite difficult, and in some cases impossible, to obtain all of the nutrients out of that grain. So they're low in nutrients, and they're also high in something called anti-nutrients. So when you actually look at what a grain is, you might think twice about whether or not you think it's important to spend your money on it. But then, and by you, I mean you out there. And so that's one thing. But another thing is, about the fiber, insoluble fiber and soluble. So there's two kinds of fiber. Plants, so we have bones and cartilage to hold ourselves up. Plants use fiber as their kind of architectural support. So there's insoluble fiber, which is the kind of tough, stringy stuff. And then there's the soluble fiber, which is the stuff that holds water and makes a plant juicy or succulent, right? So two types of fiber. And we really can't digest the insoluble fiber at all. That sort of tough, stringy, woody stuff, that essentially leaves us the same way it came in. And and people say, well, that's good for you because it sweeps your intestines clean, like you said, like a broom. But there's not a single study could I find identifying what are these things, what are these toxins it's sweeping out, what is it that it's trying to get rid of, what is it that's been accumulating that it's sparing us from. There's not a single study on that. And the other issue is that if you can actually eat too much insoluble fiber, it is by definition indigestible, and therefore can, surprise, surprise, cause indigestion, constipation, bloating, difficulty, just sort of pain, all kinds of symptoms. I mean, some people tolerate fiber better than others, but all of us have a limit to how much fiber we can tolerate. We're not designed, to eat more than a certain amount of fiber, even if we have a very healthy gut. So for a lot of people, and I find this in my clinical practice all the time, for a lot of people who have difficulty digesting whatever the issue is, they've got IBS symptoms or chronic constipation or bloating or whatever it may be, any kind of digestive issue, often they're told to increase their fiber, or that's what they've been led to believe. So they do that. And in many cases, it either doesn't help or it makes things worse, which makes sense when you think about what fiber is. So it often is very helpful to eat less fiber rather than more. And I see this in my practice all the time. But again, some people do better with fiber than others, just as some people tolerate carbohydrate better than others. And this is another reason I wrote the book, is because there is no one-size-fits-all strategy for people, right? It depends on how healthy you are, what your goals are. Are you taking medications? Are you trying to lose weight? Are you exercising? Are you male, female, pregnant, 5 years old, 95 years old? I mean, lots of different things come into play when people are designing their diets, but there are certain things that are true for all of us. And just certain basic principles. We all need a certain amount of protein. We all need a certain amount of fat and specific types of fats that we can't make ourselves. None of us requires any carbohydrate at all. It's completely optional. So whether you decide to get your carbohydrate from outside your body, from your food, or from inside your body, because we can make it ourselves, is a matter of A, personal choice, and B, your metabolic health and how well you can tolerate and how much you can tolerate carbohydrate. Now, none of us should be eating refined carbohydrates like sugars and flours and cereals and things like that. They're just dangerous for our metabolic health. So even if you're metabolically healthy right now, if you continue to eat those naked carbohydrates that turn rapidly into glucose in the bloodstream, giving you dangerously high spikes in blood sugar and dangerously high spikes in insulin levels, if you eat that way, your metabolic health will eventually suffer, even if you're healthy right now. So those we should all avoid. But whether all of us need to avoid, fruits and starchy vegetables, I don't think that's the case. I think many of us can include those safely in our diets. But if you've got a significant degree of metabolic damage at this point, which more than 50% of us now do, depending on which study you look at, depending on how you define it, it's more like 90%, then you may need to reduce your carbohydrate intake even from those healthier whole food sources like fruits and vegetables. And this is the nuance, right? So I think it really matters. And people can figure this out. Now we have all these wonderful tools now, like continuous glucose monitors, that can help people figure out, how the foods they love are affecting their metabolic health. And if they're not safe for your metabolic health, they won't be safe for your mental health either.
One of the criticisms, though, and I'm super glad that the FDA recently approved the first CGM for use in non-diabetic populations. But I guess one of the longstanding criticisms against the use of these tools in non-diabetic individuals is that they might lead to a pathologization. I don't know if that's a word, but
that's okay.
Yeah, it might.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, it might lead to people pathologizing, foods like berries or sweet potatoes or things like that, like foods that are obviously quite healthy, but of course inevitably are going to lead to a normal pathologic blood sugar quote unquote spike.
Well, normal and pathological are two different things, right? So it depends on who you are. So some people can eat sweet potatoes and apples and bananas and berries and handle them quite beautifully, and others cannot. And you need to know who you are. You need to know who you are. Because if you're getting, yes, it's normal for glucose to spike after eating carbohydrates. There's nothing wrong with a glucose spike. There's nothing wrong with an insulin spike. It depends on the degree. So how high is your glucose spiking? How long is it taking to come back down? How high is your insulin spiking? How long is it taking to come back down? How often are you eating those foods? Are you ever getting a break from a high insulin level, from a high insulin state? So these things matter. So if your glucose and insulin levels are running too high too often, that is dangerous and can cause irreversible damage to brain metabolism over time. Irreversible. So there's that piece of the puzzle. So if you say, eat a banana and your, blood sugar spikes just say, 110, 120, but it comes back down in an hour or two and you're not eating bananas all day long, that could be perfectly lovely for you. If you're eating a banana and your blood sugar is spiking to 160, 170, 180, and it's staying up for hours, that means also that your insulin level is staying up for hours. That is dangerous. So it's not that bananas are evil or bananas are it's about your personal metabolic health and how your diet is interacting with your physiology. And if we hadn't, so many of us, eaten the wrong way for so many decades because we've been given the wrong information and the wrong foods for so long, if you hadn't broken your metabolism to that degree, I suspect that you would be perfectly healthy, eating lots of fruits and vegetables whenever you felt like eating them, which many of our ancestral, populations, some of them ate diets that were quite high in starch and fruit, depending on where they lived, tropical islands and things like that. But they didn't develop dementia and obesity and all kinds of other, mental illnesses. So it's not the amount of carbohydrate in the diet. It's the quality of the carbohydrate in the diet, the amount of the poor quality carbohydrate in the diet, and how metabolically healthy you currently are. So that's at least how I look at it. And if you can use a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, to help you figure out what your personal sweet spot is. I have a whole chapter about that, helping people understand where they want to be and why it's so important to the health of your brain long term. Because even if you don't have a mental health problem right now, if you're eating too many of the wrong foods too often, specifically the refined carbohydrates and the vegetable oils, you are deliberately, these foods are directly causing inflammation, oxidative stress, and insulin resistance. These are the three really prime drivers of most of the mental and physical health conditions that we all fear, including depression and bipolar disorder and Alzheimer's dementia. So these are the damaging forces. And if you understand what your brain needs, what the foods are best at nourishing, protecting, and energizing your brain, then you could potentially prevent a lifetime of mental health problems, which now again it's now 1 in 3 of young adults now have mental health problems. And so how many of those people are suffering right now with depression, with bipolar disorder, with anxiety, with OCD, with PTSD? How many of those people might be perfectly well if they had the right information about diet and chose to apply it?
What proportion of our collective mental distress would you say is attributable to diet? Because, obviously, the modern world has become dysregulated in so many ways, right?
Yes.
Spiritual crisis, right? Chronic overconsumption of news media, overly sedentary lifestyles. Would you say that nutrition, what slice of the pie would you say nutrition accounts for?
I honestly have no idea. I know some people in research papers have tried to quantify it as at about 80% or so. That's a huge number, the people who are making that estimate. And I wouldn't be surprised if it were that high. And the reason why I say that is because I'm a psychiatrist. I use I'm a nutritional and metabolic psychiatrist. So that means that I help people improve the overall quality of their diet, the nutritional quality of their diet, but I also help them improve the metabolic quality of their diet, meaning that I don't just focus on eating healthy foods, nutritious foods, but I also help them figure out where they are on the insulin resistance spectrum and how low they need to go with their carbohydrate intake and to bring their insulin levels down into a healthy range. I also use one of the cornerstones of my practice is the ketogenic diet, which is one of the most powerful tools I have at my disposal to help people with mental health conditions. So what I can tell you using a variety of different nutrition strategies in my practice for more than a dozen years now is that almost everyone, and I've worked with hundreds of people with all kinds of mental health conditions from major to minor in adults of all ages, almost everyone improves to some noticeable degree when you improve their diet. And I think I can count on fewer than 2 hands, maybe 1.5 hands, how many people did not experience meaningful improvement to their mental health. So I think that the 80% is probably a fair estimate. It may even be more than that. It's a really hard question to answer with any specificity. We really are guessing.
Yeah, well, but I love that you leave room for uncertainty. I think that's really important. I do want to go. This is a really controversial topic, but I feel like I feel comfortable in taking this conversation here with you. The whole debate about seed oils. From the standpoint of seed oils, what concerns you about their impact on the brain? Now, I will just share I have a bias against them.
Yes.
I avoid them. If for no other reason, then I'd rather not put my health in the hands of Mazola, and like these manufacturers of these super high margin, ultra processed novel fats. But I know that the evidence is fairly equivocal, and today, if you discuss them in a light that is anything but utterly favorable, some will label you as a quack, It's become a very contentious topic. So what about seed oils in particular concerns you as a psychiatrist?
So this was not a topic that I'd learned very much about before I started researching the book, but I wanted to address it in the book for this reason, is that it is a very controversial topic. The science is really new. There's not that much solid science in this area yet. It's growing. But I wanted to understand, how these seed oils, these refined seed oils, sunflower oil, safflower oil, etc., soybean oil, how these oils, which are supposedly heart healthy, supposedly contain essential polyunsaturated fatty acids that are really good for you, how they affect the brain. because I know there's a lot of emerging science around how they affect, how they might be contributing to, say, for example, metabolic disorders of the rest of the body. So obesity and fatty liver disease and heart disease and things like that. So interesting and concerning information coming out in those fields, but that's not my area of interest, right? My area of interest is the brain. And what I found was, it's all very new, but what I found was really interesting and concerning. So first I wanted to know, well, does the brain absorb these? So the issue with vegetable oils is that many of them are exceedingly unnaturally high in a polyunsaturated fatty acid called linoleic acid. This is not for you. I know you know this. This is for people listening, right? So linoleic acid. It's a very fragile, long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acid that we're told is essential. I would argue that it's not, and I explain why I argue that it's not essential in the book. But that's another topic. But whether or not it's essential, what do we do with it? So you eat the vegetable oil, high amounts of linoleic acid. In some types of oils, much higher than 50% of the fat is linoleic acid. And this linoleic acid, so at first I was like, well, does it cross the blood-brain barrier? Can we absorb it? Yes. So all of the polyunsaturated fatty acids, the omega-3s and the omega-6s, linoleic acid is omega-6, they're all absorbed by the brain to a significant extent. So some of it crosses the blood-brain barrier. So then what happens to it? So we're told that the reason we need to eat linoleic acid is to make arachidonic acid, which is a really important omega-6 fatty acid for the brain. But that is not what the brain does with it. The brain, it turns out, takes almost all of the linoleic acid it absorbs and burns it for energy. That's not good. The reason why that's not good is the brain is designed to burn very small molecules for energy. So ketones, very small bits of fat, essentially, fragments of fat, and glucose, very small fragment of starch or carbohydrate, right? Because when you try to burn longer molecules for energy, you get more oxidative stress than you otherwise would. Burning anything is going to cause oxidative stress. Oxidative stress happens. We must endure a certain amount of oxidative stress, no matter what we're burning for energy, glucose, ketones, or anything else. But the longer the molecule, if you're trying to burn a fatty acid for energy, you're going to create a lot more oxidative stress. And so that's the reason why the brain can't protect itself very well against oxidative stress compared to other organs in the body. It's much more vulnerable to oxidative stress. And oxidative stress is just essentially when we're breaking down fuel when we're breaking down food and turning it into energy, that process requires that we split an oxygen atom in half so that it can catch the electrons coming through the electron transport chain. This is it's in the book if you want to learn more about it. People out there. So anyway, you have to split oxygen atoms in order to make energy. And when you split an oxygen atom, you're kind of playing with fire because oxygen atoms, when you split them and are really reactive, and so you've kind of set a bull loose in a china shop, right? So it can randomly, these are called oxygen-free radicals, and they can run loose, and they can be very damaging because they will react with anything they encounter because they were trying to be stable again, right? So they'll bind onto things and break them. So anyway, oxidation happens. But we have our own internal antioxidants to deal with the oxidative stress that Mother Nature knows we are going to see. You have to eat. You have to break oxygen in half. You have to run your electron transport chain. You have to do these things. So we have our own internal antioxidants, and I think most people in the world don't know that. We are, I think, led to believe that antioxidants only come from colorful plant foods. Right? That you must eat these superfoods in order to bolster yourself against this oxidative stress. But how often are we told to stop eating the things that are causing excessive oxidative stress in the first place? When you eat a healthy diet, the amount of oxidative stress that is produced is manageable. We can handle it. Our own internal antioxidants will mop up those free radicals, and that will be fine. There'll be a balance between the oxidative stress that naturally must occur and the antioxidant capacity that we naturally have. no plant foods required. The problem is, if you are eating lots of refined carbohydrate and lots of vegetable oil, you're going to get lots of oxidative stress. You're going to overwhelm those natural internal antioxidants, our own defenses. And so our antioxidant molecules will not be able to won't be able to mop up all of those free radicals. So some of those free radicals are going to spill out into the neighborhood and terrorize the village. So they're going to bump into things randomly and just cause all kinds of very damaging, lots of damage to the area. Oxidative stress is very, very damaging. And too much of it, is what lays the groundwork for all kinds of mental and physical health conditions. So we're told all the time, eat more antioxidants. We're not told eat fewer pro-oxidants, if you will. And vegetable oils this is something that's very clear in the science, they do promote oxidative stress. So this is a really important thing for people to, and so does sugar and flour and all the refined carbohydrates. So because again, you're kind of flooding your system with too many glucose molecules at once, more than we were designed to see. So if you're eating too many of the wrong carbohydrates too often, you're also overwhelming your internal antioxidant capacity.
But there is still a large cohort of the nutritional orthodoxy that's unconvinced, right? Like, they'll say that studies don't actually show that seed oils, when you consume them, like in human randomized controlled trials, are inflammatory. They don't lead to a spike in CRP or, whatever the cytokines are that they're measuring. Is there like can you envision a specific, I guess, type of study that would definitively once and for all show us that these are not beneficial from the standpoint of oxidative stress, longevity, and the like?
Yeah, it's a really good point you're making because absolutely true that you don't see an effect in the randomized controlled trials. And I think one reason for that, I can only guess at the reason, one reason might be that the baseline, the foundation of the diet is already so high in these omega-6 fatty acids that when you add more to that diet, you're not going to see a signal. So that's one possibility. But one of the ways I address this in the book is, we're told all the time, well, maybe, let's see, if you add more linoleic acid to the diet, are you going to see problems? Well, we can't detect a difference between these two groups. But the group as far as I understand it, if I'm remembering correctly, the control group is not eating a diet free of linoleic acid. I think they're eating a standard diet, and then the other group is just having more linoleic acid than that group. I'm pretty sure that's how they're done. What we want to see is what happens if you lower the linoleic acid in the diet. What happens then? And there is one study that did that. And it was a study in people with migraine headaches.
I remember that study.
Yeah. So they did see a signal there. Is it much to write home about? Is that going to be what you're going to hang your hat on? No. But that's the way I think the studies would be better designed. I think better designed studies may be able to see a signal. But I do acknowledge in the book, the science is very inconclusive on this point. But if there's any risk at all, even if we're not sure yet what it is, why would you want to take that risk? These oils are completely unnecessary in the human diet. There's no reason to consume them. So why wouldn't you want to play it safe? I mean, first of all, they have no flavor. They often taste terrible, actually. They have no nutritional value. They don't smell good or taste good. And so why would you want to subject yourself to that risk? They don't contain any essential nutrients. I mean, and even if you did think that they were essential, we have more linoleic acid stored in our body fat at this point. Americans, 21% of our body fat is now linoleic acid, whereas hunter-gatherer populations, it was more like 4%. So we're accumulating this stuff, more and more. We're basically, our fat is starting to turn into linoleic acid, and 21% is a lot. And so even if you're worried about, that you might need this compound in your diet, it would take years for you to use up the reserves you already have in your system. So even if you think it's necessary, why don't you just, use what you've already got until you take in more? I think there's no biological reason to consume these oils. And the information that is starting to come out about these oils is concerning enough that I personally recommend. I mean, I avoid them, and I personally recommend my patients do as well.
Well, it's precautionary principle. At the very least, I mean, there's so much uncertainty with regard to like how these fats, I mean, you've already indicated that they very easily cross the blood-brain barrier, you know, how they're interacting with our brains. We just don't have that data. It's a big question mark. I'm sure you've seen the review paper by Taha.
Yes.
Researcher that elucidated very clearly some of these looming questions. And as somebody who's particularly interested in long-term brain health, I mean, it's just the uncertainty alone, you know, and the fact that there's no essential need for them is enough to make me not want to bring them into my house. I mean, if I'm in a restaurant, there's no doubt that I'm ingesting, you know, some of these types of fats here and there. But, you know, the fact that, I mean, for one, I do occasionally suffer from migraines. And in that study, there was a reduction in migraine frequency from the people who reduced their consumption of linoleic acid. There's that. There's the fact that, you know, I mean, I think it's very interesting that the more linoleic acid we consume, the higher our requirement for vitamin E is. And one of the vitamin E's roles in the body is to prevent lipid oxidation, like lipid peroxidation. Vitamin E is one of the most important antioxidants when it comes to brain health. And as it currently stands, 90% of adults don't consume adequate vitamin E. So we're increasing dramatically our consumption of these kinds of fats, and we're not consuming adequate vitamin E, which these fats would otherwise normally be packaged with in nature, but we've extracted them. And so, like, what is that doing to our brain health over the long term? I mean, we've only just started over consuming these fats in the past handful of decades.
We're told all the time to follow whole food principles, except when it comes to vegetable oil. So, I mean,
so odd.
It's just strange. You're supposed to have, let's say you're sitting down to say a healthy meal that's, you know, maybe it's got some salmon on the plate and maybe it's got a salad next to it. Now you're going to pour, you've got your healthy whole foods plate, right? You've got your animal protein, you've got your vegetables. Maybe you're going to have some fruit for dessert. Healthy kind of paleo style diet, I think, is a great place for humans to start. Now you're going to pour vegetable oil, which comes from a factory, takes 15 chemical steps to produce, and one of those steps involves an explosive solvent called hexane. You're going to take this factory-generated fat and pour it all over your lunch. How does that make sense? I mean, if you can't produce it without a factory, I think it's worthy of suspicion.
Couldn't agree more. It's so true.
I think we are aligned on this.
We're very aligned. We are very aligned. You've mentioned nutritional psychiatry a number of times, which is this burgeoning field of research. I'd love if you could sort of unpack what that is and what people stand to gain from this. I mean, even though it's somewhat in its nascency, I feel like it's very exciting. Yeah. So what is nutritional psychiatry and what can we learn from it to help improve our lives?
Yeah. So, and this is a lot of what your book is about too, right? So these principles of, you know, brain healthy diets, right? What is a brain healthy diet? So nutritional psychiatry is the way that it's conceived of now is a relatively new field, maybe about 10 years old. The term nutritional psychiatry was coined by Professor Felice Jacka, whom I believe you interviewed at one point.
She's wonderful. Yeah.
She's a very prolific researcher, very knowledgeable at the University of Deakin in Australia. So she coined this term, as I understand it, nutritional psychiatry. And essentially, and has done a lot of some of the best work in the field in terms of the randomized controlled trials for depression, for example. So nutritional psychiatrists believe, as I do, that the deterioration in our global mental health largely parallels and is perhaps largely driven by the deterioration in the quality of our diet. So that's what we believe. And I believe, so I consider myself a nutritional psychiatrist. I also consider myself a metabolic psychiatrist, and metabolic psychiatry is a field that's more like 5 or 6 years old, even newer, a newer subspecialty in the field of psychiatry that focuses on the metabolic quality of the diet as opposed to the nutritional quality of diet, meaning that metabolic psychiatrists are focused on how the brain makes energy and whether to what extent metabolic problems in the body are disrupting brain metabolism and brain function to contribute to mental health problems such as dementia, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and so forth. So we're focused on the relationship between metabolic health and mental health. Nutritional psychiatry is focused on the relationship between the nutritional quality of the diet, the whole foods and so forth, and whether you can get all your nutrients from your food, and whether you're avoiding all the wrong, whether you're nourishing and protecting your brain by making the right food choices. So I really like to marry these two principles. That's why I consider myself as having a foot in both camps. Now, nutritional psychiatry is really important. I'm passionate about it, of course, and I wrote a book about it, and I use these principles in my practice every day. But the diet that most nutritional psychiatry thought leaders focus on is the Mediterranean diet. With good reason. There is lots and lots of evidence that the Mediterranean diet is much healthier for the brain and the rest of the body than the so-called standard American diet or Western diet or whatever you want to call it. It's now really the global diet. So study after study after study shows that the Mediterranean diet outperforms the standard American diet almost no matter what health condition you are studying. And depression is no exception, and that's where Professor Jacka has, and other groups as well have shown. There have been several randomized controlled trials now showing that the Mediterranean diet can be helpful in cases of clinical depression, where people who switch from a modern Western unhealthy diet to a Mediterranean diet, many of them can see improvements in their depression symptoms. And that is fantastic, right? That means diet makes a difference. And she has shown that, and colleagues in other groups have shown that as well. But just because the Mediterranean diet is better for the brain than the standard American diet does not necessarily mean it's the best diet for the brain. And I think that's where I feel we can do much better. Because let's say you've tried the Mediterranean diet and you haven't seen the improvements you were hoping for. Are you going to stop there, or is there something more you can do? There's so much more you can do. And so when I look at the Mediterranean diet, I do see that it's healthier than the standard American diet. For example, it explicitly discourages added sugars and processed foods and sweets and sodas and things like that. But it also explicitly encourages a diet, the foundation of the diet, to contain lots of grains and legumes. That the base of your diet should be grains and legumes, whole grain, not just whole grains, but refined grains are also encouraged. Breads and pastas, whole grain breads, whole grain pastas, things like that. Well, first of all, there's no such thing as whole grain bread or whole grain pasta. You cannot make pasta or bread unless you destroy the integrity of the grain. You can't. It won't hold together, right? So there's that issue. In fact, the people often get really confused about whole grains and refined grains and where that line is. What's a healthy whole grain? How do they know? And that's because the USDA explicitly defines for the food manufacturing industry, says that you can label your product whole grain as long as you put back into that product the same ratio of bits that a whole grain contains. So as long as whatever the three parts of the grain are, the endosperm, basically the fiber coating, the bran, the germ, and the endosperm, it's got a grain contains three components, a whole grain. You can blast that grain to smithereens and put that powder into your product, whether it's a bread or a cereal or whatever it is, and you can still label that product whole grain as long as the ratio of its bits are the same as the original whole grain contained. So that's I think it's a very strange use of the word whole. And,
you're completely disrupting the food matrix.
Did you ever see that movie, Princess Bride?
No, I'm embarrassed to say that I haven't.
That's okay.
But...
You don't have to. You don't have to. It's not anything you need to worry that you haven't seen. But for anybody who's watching, if they've ever seen The Princess Bride, there's a famous line in The Princess Bride by this character Inigo Montoya, and his famous line is, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means."
That's where that line comes from.
Oh, do you know that line?
Mm-hmm, I know the line. Yeah.
I mean, it's ridiculous. So anyway, that was an aside. But coming back to the Mediterranean diet, yes, it removes some of the unhealthy foods in our diet. So it says, you really should, be careful with sweets, don't eat processed food, things like that. Don't drink sugary beverages, don't add sugar to things. And Mediterranean diet, to its credit, includes animal foods, including meat, seafood, poultry. Emphasizes they should be lean. I don't agree with that, but that's okay. It's fine. The dairy products should be low fat and non-fat and that sort of thing. We don't agree on all these things, but that's okay. They include animal foods. I think that's important. They discourage the use of certain processed foods, but they explicitly encourage some things that are really not optimal for us, including things like breads and pastas and cereals. So I think explicitly, encouraging refined carbohydrates is a slippery slope and sends a mixed message about, what is really healthiest for us. But the other thing, it also encourages red wine consumption, not a brain healthy beverage, not a single study to show that. We could go into that if you want. So, the Mediterranean diet, the foundation of it is nutrient poor, anti-nutrient rich grains and legumes. So these are much more risk than benefit. But again, this pattern is a little bit healthier than the standard American diet. But in my opinion, what it really is doing is it's nibbling around the edges of the standard American diet, but not going far enough. And again, if you want real fun, the Mediterranean diet's never been shown to, help anybody with a serious mental illness or to, stop epileptic seizures in its tracks. And ketogenic diets have been. And so a lot of people will say, get confused and will say, how can both of these diets be good for the brain? And the truth is, both of these diets are good for the brain. Both of these diets are better for the brain than the standard American diet. It depends on what your goal is and what your condition is. Because in a lot of cases, there are certain conditions. Let's take dementia, for example. You know very well, because you've written about this, that the brains of people who are suffering from dementia can no longer process glucose to its full capacity and turn it into energy. There's been damage to brain metabolism. The brain has by the time you notice any memory problems, if you're on the road to dementia, your brain may have lost up to 25% of its glucose processing capacity, the ability to turn carbohydrates into energy. In those cases, a Mediterranean diet's not going to help you because you need an alternative fuel source. You're going to need to bridge that energy gap. And a Mediterranean diet can't do that because its foundation is 45 to 65% carbohydrate. If you're eating that much carbohydrate, your insulin levels can't come down enough to turn fat burning on, generate ketones, and that'll cross the blood-brain barrier and bridge that energy gap. That's what needs to happen for people who have lost so much of their brain glucose processing capacity. That's a perfect example of where a Mediterranean diet may be better for you, but it's not going to really help you. And there are many cases now of serious mental illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder is another wonderful example, where a ketogenic diet has helped people where no other diet has been able to help them. And we have studies in this area now. And so, for example, in 2022, I co-authored a study that documented and analyzed the work of a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Albert Donat in Toulouse, France, a psychiatrist who's been practicing for more than 35 years. He invited 31 of his most treatment-resistant patients who had been suffering with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression for years, an average of 10 years, some as long as 30 years, people who are on an average at the time of the study began 5 psychiatric medications, not at all unusual in chronic mental illness to see that number of psychiatric medications, and all of whom had at least one marker of poor metabolic health, such as obesity or type 2 diabetes or high triglyceride levels. Invited them to come into the hospital to try a mildly ketogenic whole foods diet under his supervision. And 28 of those 31 patients were able to stay on the diet for more than 2 weeks, which is what you need to do to start to see improvement. And every single one of those patients improved both metabolically and psychiatrically. 43% of them achieved clinical remission for the first time, and 64% of them left the hospital on less psychiatric medication than when they came in. So these are patients who had been suffering for years with serious mental illnesses, where they'd been hospitalized one or more times before, and had never achieved those kinds of that degree of relief from their condition. And some of these patients had been under the care of this very same psychiatrist for 30 years. So he had tried everything that he knew to help them: psychotherapy, hospitalizations, medication changes. And so, and we have new research coming out now, even this year. The new study was just published yesterday out of Stanford. Dr. Shivani Sethi just published a study, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, improving. 79% of patients improved on a ketogenic diet.
Wow.
4 months. And my friend and colleague, Dr. Ian Campbell at the University of Edinburgh, who put his own bipolar disorder into remission more than 7 years ago on a ketogenic diet. He is now he's doing some really sophisticated research in this area. He did a pilot study that he published last year, where he asked people with bipolar disorder to try a ketogenic diet, track their ketone levels using a blood meter, and track their symptoms. He also measured, this was really remarkable, he measured the levels of a neurotransmitter in the brain called glutamate using magnetic resonance spectroscopy imaging, which is just an imaging test where you can look at the neurotransmitter activity inside the brain, which is really fascinating. And high glutamate levels are often seen in bipolar disorder and certain other psychiatric conditions. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter where if it's out of balance, if there's too much glutamate, you can get something called glutamate excitotoxicity, very damaging for the brain. And so what he did was he asked them to try ketogenic diets. It was an 8-week pilot study. They remained in good therapeutic ketosis 91% of the time, so they were able to follow the diet. That was one of the things he wanted to find out. Could people with serious mental illness follow the diet? Could they measure their ketone levels? Yes, they could. Could they stay in ketosis? Yes, they could. And then further, how did they feel? And the higher their ketone levels were, the better their mood was, their energy level was, the lower their irritability scores were. They felt better the higher their ketone levels were. And he documents that beautifully in his paper. The other thing he did was he documented the biggest drop in brain glutamate levels ever recorded in any type of study, because researchers have been trying to lower glutamate levels in people with bipolar disorder, primarily with medications and other types of interventions, for a long time. And he documented the greatest reduction in brain glutamate levels that has ever been recorded. So he is now on the brink of, designing a large randomized controlled trial, which would be, really, I think, so exciting for the, 1 to 4% of the population that suffer from bipolar disorder.
Yeah, as a therapeutic diet, the ketogenic diet, it seems like there's so much potential, and yet so many still consider it to be a fringe diet. And I remember, I don't want to speak for her, but Felice Chaka, she herself wasn't really a fan, if I recall correctly, of keto diets, which was kind of odd to me.
Yeah, I think that people study the diet that they are most interested in, and they may not know as much about the diets that they're not paying attention to. But again, I don't want to take anything away from her work. I think it's really important work that she has done and continues to do. And I just want people who are suffering with mental illnesses of any kind to know that, if a Mediterranean diet hasn't helped them, or if I want them to know that there's more, that there are other dietary strategies available, and some that are potentially much more powerful. And the reason why ketogenic diets people think of them as weight loss diets, when, for one thing, you can construct them to gain weight, lose weight, or maintain weight. It just depends on how you construct them, right? And essentially how many calories are in the diet. But the other thing that a lot of people may not realize is that the ketogenic diet wasn't originally invented for weight loss. It was originally designed back in 1921 to stabilize brain chemistry in children with epilepsy, severe epilepsy, having multiple seizures per day before the arrival of useful seizure medications. And a very effective intervention, actually. And so the ketogenic diet stabilizes brain chemistry. I mean, the ability to stop seizures in its tracks in more than 50% of patients. If that doesn't tell you that the diet stabilizes brain chemistry, I don't know what proof you would need. So that's a very black and white, dramatic, case of stabilizing brain chemistry. So, and bipolar disorder and epilepsy have so much in common that psychiatrists like myself, I've been practicing for 25 years. I prescribed anticonvulsant medications, seizure medications, every day for people with bipolar disorder to try to help, reduce symptoms of mania and prevent mood swings, right? We use the same medications to treat bipolar disorder as we do to treat epilepsy. Could we use the same diet? It appears that we can. So this is a really powerful tool because it doesn't just, improve the nutritional quality of the diet. In fact, depending on the ketogenic diet you eat, you might not be eating a very healthy diet. This is the problem, is that this is why I like to marry the two concepts, and that's what I've done in this book. You want a healthy, nutritious whole foods diet. And in a lot of cases, depending on your metabolic health and the condition you're dealing with, you may also want ketones. You may also want to be in ketosis much of the time or all of the time, depending. But you can be in ketosis and eat a really junky diet. You can be in ketosis, and ketosis doesn't require, it's not about how many animal foods you eat or plant foods you eat. You can eat a vegan ketogenic diet, you can eat a carnivore ketogenic diet, and everything in between. It's not about the food list. It's about the macronutrient ratio that brings your insulin level down enough to turn on fat burning and generate ketones. Lots of different food patterns will do that, including some really unhealthy ones. So that's why I like to combine the two. If you need ketones, I want to show you how to get into ketosis, but I want you to do it with a healthy dietary foundation where you're eating whole foods, nutritious foods that are safe for your metabolism and that will deliver the nutrients your brain needs. I want you to nourish your brain, energize your brain with ketones, and protect your brain from damaging inflammation and oxidative stress. So we take the junk out, we put the whole foods in, and you dial your insulin levels down to where you need them to be to energize your brain in a completely different way than a carbohydrate-based diet can do. And there's lots of ways to get into ketosis. And I think you did a really nice job of this in your book, by the way. There's lots of ways to get into ketosis and turn on those pathways, the autophagy pathways, sort of the recycling pathways and the healing pathways and the sort of cleaning pathways, the maintenance pathways. Lots of ways to do that. You can eat a ketogenic diet. You can use intermittent fasting. You can restrict calories. You can exercise intensely. Lots of ways to get into ketosis, right? So, but if you need to maintain ketosis long term, there's only one way you can do that without fasting or calorie restricting or exercising, if that's the way you choose to do it, and that's by following these macronutrient rules. So if you combine these two principles, you get really powerful interventions that I think should form a new definition of a brain healthy diet. We talk about heart healthy diets all the time. What's a brain healthy diet? So it has to nourish, protect, and energize the brain, and you have to know where the nutrients are, and you have to know where the damaging ingredients are, and you have to know where you stand on the insulin resistance spectrum, and you have to know what your glucose and insulin levels are, and whether you're okay with carbohydrates and what kinds of carbohydrates and how much. And if you don't know those things, you're kind of flying blind in terms of your, not just your mental health, but your general metabolic health.
Why do you think, I mean, obviously mental health disorders are a different beast than neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's disease, dementia, and the like. But why do you think the ketogenic diet, for all of its potential, it hasn't proven to be the silver bullet that I think many of us hoped that it would, show to be in the literature over the past few years? I mean, it's obviously a condition that takes years, if not decades, to develop in the brain. And I know some of the studies, and they're small studies, but they've shown, that there's some therapeutic benefit depending on how early it's adopted, right? Like for milder Alzheimer's as compared to more severe Alzheimer's. Why do you think that is the case? You think by the time it progresses to more moderate and severe levels, it's just like too much pathology at that point?
I'm so glad you asked this question, because you're absolutely right. And so one of my jobs, one of the things I do is I teach a CME clinician training program for ketogenic diets and mental health. And the first module of that training program is all about what the clinical studies tell us about ketogenic diets in various types of conditions, not just bipolar disorder and depression, but also dementia, right? And what you say is absolutely true. The clinical trial evidence on ketogenic diets for dementia is pretty unimpressive. So, and I make that point in the training program that, look, these are pretty minuscule improvements. The results, yes, they're as good or maybe a little better than existing medication treatments, but that's not saying much, because existing medication treatments have a dismal track record of improving cognitive function in people with mild cognitive impairment and early Alzheimer's and moderate Alzheimer's disease, right? So why do these studies, if the ketogenic diet is so amazing at, bridging that energy gap, shouldn't the brain come to life, and shouldn't we see better results? Two ideas I have about that. One is that in these studies, the highest, they were even the best designed randomized controlled trial I'm aware of to date, got the ketone levels, the beta hydroxybutyrate levels in the blood to an average of 0.95 millimole, just below 1 millimole. That's, maybe they didn't get as much response because the diet wasn't ketogenic enough, the ketone levels weren't high enough. That's one possibility. But I don't know, because we haven't done the study with higher ketone levels. But the other thing is, as you say, this is a neurodegenerative disease, meaning brain is dying, brain tissue is being lost, and it starts decades before, in many cases, as you said, rightly said. This is a disease that is developing over decades silently in the background. Brain glucose metabolism is becoming more and more sluggish over time. And that's one of the hallmarks. That's one of the drivers of the disease is sluggish brain glucose processing. So could it be that there's a point of no return or a point of minimal, diminishing returns? That could be a big part of it. That, maybe you've lost too much tissue or too much function, or it's too late, to do anything about it. Obviously, prevention is much more important in these cases than treatment. And you cannot begin too early to prevent dementia. I don't care how old you are. If you're 7 years old out there, you want to start now, right? To protect your brain metabolism by eating whole foods and keeping your insulin and glucose levels in a healthy range. That's what needs to happen. One of the many things that needs to happen. So why don't we see? So we don't see great results in these studies. Could it be that the ketone levels are too low? Maybe. Could it be that, we've reached a point of diminishing returns? Maybe. Could it be that the diet wasn't good enough? Not just ketone-wise, but they never tell you what people are eating in these studies. It's so funny. You look right at the methods section, they won't tell you. So what I can say is that you can sometimes see really excellent results in certain cases of even what you might think would be dementia that would be difficult or impossible to reverse. So I've seen this in my own practice, and I include a case in the book of a woman who had mild cognitive impairment for something like 20 years, starting in her early 40s after a head injury, who was thought to be progressing to dementia in her early 60s. Was given that tentative diagnosis, was referred to a neurologist, said, "Oh, you can see a neurologist to confirm the diagnosis in 10 weeks. Meanwhile, enjoy your life," right? So she started a ketogenic diet while she was waiting for her neurology appointment, got her ketone levels. I said, please, I recommend getting your ketone levels up above 1 millimole. Try to keep them in the sort of 1 to 3 millimole range as often as you can. She followed the diet to a T, and within weeks, her cognition improved noticeably. Her chief complaint originally, when the thing that really got her attention and why she went back to her doctor to get that diagnosis was this: she sat down at her sewing machine that she'd used almost every day for 50 years, couldn't remember how to thread the machine. She was terrified. So she was easily able, after the ketogenic diet, within just weeks, thread the machine, sit down, have long, fluent conversations with her son, which had become a problem, able to find her car in parking lots, which had been an issue for her for years. By the time she got to the neurologist, her memory testing was normal. Wow. And so he said, this is the wonderful thing we're starting to see. He said, "I'm so glad you're on this diet. This is a really good diet, for this condition." And he was thrilled that she was on the diet and told her to keep it up. And so she continues on this diet to this day. She's been on, I think, a couple of years, almost 3 years now, still doing very well. And so you can see this in patients if you work closely with them. The other thing is that there was a beautiful case report published. I don't know if you've seen it. Just in recent months, of a woman with Down syndrome who had progressive dementia. Have you seen that case report?
No.
I want to bring it to your attention because I think you would find it so useful in your work. So this was a woman in her 40s with Down syndrome, and Down syndrome is, a genetic condition for people who are listening who might not know. People are born with Down syndrome. It's a very severe brain condition, genetic, and due to in any case, a genetic condition. I won't go into the details. These are people who are profound intellectual disabilities, and they're very high risk for severe, rapidly progressive, early onset dementia.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so for people who work with people with Down syndrome, that's very well known that they almost always develop, usually in their 30s or 40s, and that's usually how they die. Their lives are shortened by decades, usually by the dementia. And so this woman, just as the textbooks would say, she was actually fairly high functioning for somebody with Down syndrome. She lived with her mother, and her mother provided quite a bit of support. But this particular woman had a lot of richness in her life, and participated in social activities, and was fairly independent with a lot of her self-care. And then in her 40s, she started rapidly declining. And her activities of daily living, within 4 years, she developed seizures, psychosis, and complete dependence on her mother for activities of daily living and self-care. And the mother had heard about ketogenic diets, but never in a million years thought that her daughter would follow a ketogenic diet. Thought it would be too challenging. And so she put her on a paleo diet. The daughter, who obesity is also very, very common in people with Down syndrome. This woman was also had obesity, lost a lot of weight on the paleo diet, but no improvement in cognition. So the mother lowered the carbohydrate intake a little bit more, got down to 75 grams a day. The daughter lost a little bit more weight, still no improvement in cognition. So then, with the help of Dr. Annette Bosworth, a physician in Florida, who they happen to live in Florida, went on to a ketogenic diet, and the seizures disappeared, the psychosis disappeared, her activity of daily living score came back to its previous baseline. She was able to re-engage in all of the social activities, all of the activities of daily living that she had become dependent on her mother for. And there's actually a video interview of her with her mother, done by Dr. Brett Scher on the Metabolic Mind website, where you can hear the mother's story. It's just a remarkable story. I mean, you would think This woman had been declining rapidly for 4 years and was so severely impaired at that point that, I think that most people would have thought this is a case that is going to be impossible to reverse. Even in severe cases, I'm not saying in every case, we know that it's possible. It's now a possibility, right? Ketogenic diets have unique brain healing properties. The way they energize the brain, the way they reduce inflammation, oxidative stress, the way that they reduce the pressure on metabolism, the way that they allow the brain to spend more time in that healing state is just unparalleled. There's no other diet that is capable of this degree of healing. So in a wide variety of conditions. So we now have evidence mounting in bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, major depression. We've got trials going on all around the world, being started up in ADHD, in OCD, in PTSD. And so in anorexia, strangely enough, there is a researcher by the name of Dr. Guido Frank at the University of California, San Diego, who is launching a clinical trial of ketogenic diet in anorexia. Not underweight anorexia, weight restored anorexia, because people who have regained their, have gained weight and recovered, from a weight standpoint from anorexia are still often plagued by eating disordered thinking. And it's been shown in a few very nice cases that have been published that people with weight restored anorexia can see improvement in those in that eating disordered thinking that often persists long after weight has been restored. Now, these studies also use a ketogenic diet in combination with ketamine infusions, so it's not the ketogenic diet on its own. But isn't that interesting? I think most people would find it interesting that a ketogenic diet can be used for some very unusual, from some applications you might think would not respond to a ketogenic diet.
So interesting, yeah. I mean, I have very little experience with eating disorders and disordered eating, and I know just from my very distant vantage point of how it's typically treated, it's typically like you want to remove the morality surrounding food, and it's like you want, there's like this all foods fit approach for somebody who's long believed certain foods to be really bad or, really guilt inducing or shame inducing. So it's interesting because the ketogenic diet obviously excludes, quite a number of foods, but I guess by working on the neurochemistry, maybe it's like a different pathway.
Well, you're touching on something so important, is that I've worked with people with eating disorders my whole career, not severe underweight anorexia. That's almost always referred to specialist teams. Even in college settings, I, was not working with people with underweight anorexia because we had specialist teams. It's a very complicated condition. So, but people with overeating disorders, right? Overeating disorders are very, very common. Anorexia, not so much. But the ketogenic diet is really a godsend for overeating disorders because it satisfies cells' need for energy in between meals. When your insulin levels are running too high, your brain literally can't see that you've got fat and energy stored that can be burned, because high insulin turns fat burning off. So you're going to get hungry between meals because your insulin level is too high, and you can only store a certain amount of carbohydrate and burn it. We can very, very small amount. So not only does it feed your cells in between meals, so you're less likely to eat in between meals, less likely to be triggered to want to eat, but it also removes a lot of the addictive ultra-processed foods that drive a lot of the overeating behaviors in the first place. So a lot of people overeat, but we're often told, and I've been one of them in my life. I mean, I grew up with a weight problem. Everyone in my family, so I've been on a diet since I was 7 years old, and I, as a human being and also as a psychiatrist, thinking about these conditions, a lot of people overeat, but why? Is it psychological? Is it emotional? Is it emotional eating? Is it stress? Is it some weakness in character? Is it trauma? All these different things. But there are ingredients in the processed foods we eat that destabilize our appetite hormones and destabilize our stress hormones and destabilize our emotional chemistry. So when you remove those foods that are making you overeat, it is a lot easier not to overeat. These foods, the ultra-processed foods, they are designed on purpose, as you know very well, to be addictive. You're not going to sell a product that's satisfying. You're not going to sell enough of that. People are going to have a few bites and they'll be full. How are you going to make money off of that? Exactly. Right? So you want to design a product that people can't stop eating, that bypasses all of our internal hormonal stop signs. That's what you want. You want a food that just runs all the red lights. And we have red lights in our bodies. Other animals don't overeat unless you give them kibble. Other animals don't become obese and diabetic when presented with ample food in their environment. It doesn't make we're feeding ourselves the wrong way. We say, oh, this is emotional eating or stress eating. Well, do we ever stop and think about how the foods that we're eating, these ultra processed, they're not even foods, these products that we're eating, destabilize our hormones? These are the hormones. We often say, well, I'm eating because I'm hormonal, or I'm eating because I'm stressed, or I'm emotional, or I'm anxious. Well, eating the wrong foods can make you feel that way. So it's a vicious cycle. If you're eating the wrong products, your appetite hormones are going to be destabilized. Your stress hormones are going to go through the roof. There's a study I share in the book where they give healthy teenage boys a sugary cola and compare that to healthy teenage boys drinking a sugar-free cola. And the boys who drank the sugary cola, their adrenaline levels, stress hormone levels spiked to 4 to 5 times baseline 4 to 5 hours later. The sugar-free cola, nothing. This is not a subtle effect. And a lot of these kids had symptoms, shaking and sweating and anxiety, and this is not normal. So we have to stop and ask ourselves, what's driving these behaviors? We can't medicate our way out of this with GLP-1 agonists, like Wegovy and I'm blanking on the name of the other one that's so popular. Ozempic.
Yeah.
Is that going to be our answer? Expensive injections? We're going to start our children taking injections so that they can continue. We're in denial about our ability to continue to eat this way and be healthy. We can't. We just can't. We have to stop.
It's insane. I mean, that's what children are consuming. I mean, 70%, upwards of 70% of the calories of a child today in the Western world is ultra processed, and they're consuming sugar sweetened beverages like it's going out of style. And then we ask them to sit for 8 hours at a time a day, in school. And because they can't focus, oh my God, who'd have predicted that? We send them off to a psychiatrist and get them a prescription to Adderall.
Well, no, of course. I mean, it would be. How would we expect them to function if we're feeding them? The brain needs the right ingredients. And if you're not giving the brain what it needs and you're giving it all these things it doesn't need, these foods, these non-foods, these products, whatever you want to call them,
yeah,
they destabilize and damage brain from within. So we are damaging our children's. We think of these foods as children's foods, things like cookies and crackers and pudding pops and ice cream and donuts and muffins, and the kids need healthy food more than adults do. They need real whole foods, nourishing animal foods and whole plant foods. They need nutritious whole foods. They're still growing and their brain is still maturing. So the other really concerning thing to me is that the brain's pruning process continues until our early 20s, when the brain is deciding, okay, which pathways are you using, which pathways are you not using? The pathways that you're not using very much, we're going to destroy those because you don't seem to need them. The pathways that you're using all the time, we're going to cement those in place because those seem to be important. That healthy habits, they begin really young. That's when we're most impressionable. And so if you teach kids healthy habits and use those pathways, all the lifestyle pathways, exercise and sleep and good nutrition, all the things we know are good for us, you set the foundation for robust mental health for the rest of their life. And if you feed them the wrong food, the brain gets the wrong information, everything's destabilized, everything's becoming damaged, oxidative stress, inflammation, addiction to these products. How do you expect that child to function or grow up to be mentally well or for their brain to last them until their 80s or 90s? I mean, dementia is largely driven by insulin resistance. We now have children who have obesity and insulin resistance. This is not going to be a disease of old age anymore.
No.
It's terrifying.
It's shocking, the milieu, the environment that we've inherited. And I'd almost say we don't stand a chance, but we do when we've got warriors such as yourself on the ground.
And you.
Yeah, thank you. That means a lot. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm optimistic. I think there's still a lot of advocacy that we need to do. A lot more research needs to be done. But yeah, I'm honored to be in the fight with you.
Well, I know that you got into this because of your mother, right? Mm-hmm. How many people have to, this is the thing that really upsets me, how many people have to figure this out for themselves or stumble it into themselves or accidentally discover it? Why can't the information be given to everybody now, right? So how many people are going to read your book? How many people are going to read my book? Why should they have to read our books? Why shouldn't this be taught in medical schools? Why shouldn't this information be coming out of nutrition education programs? Why should we have the wrong information in our guidelines? Why are journals continuing to publish nutrition epidemiology studies which are completely unscientific through and through? We shouldn't have to figure this out for ourselves. And our patients, my patients, shouldn't have to accidentally stumble on. Dr. Ian Campbell, the researcher at the University of Edinburgh who put his own bipolar disorder into remission on a ketogenic diet, he stumbled into that diet because he was trying to lose weight. He had no idea it was going to, in 3 days, lift his bipolar depression. In 3 days.
Wow.
He had no idea. That wasn't even part of his plan.
Wow.
He was just trying to lose some weight. People need to know how powerful these diets are for mental health. And I can't recommend a ketogenic diet to people and have them accept it as a viable treatment option if they believe that a ketogenic diet, because it doesn't contain whole grains and rainbow fruits, for example, or that it doesn't contain 45 to 65% carbohydrate, or heaven forbid that I advise them to include some animal foods, if they think that diet's going to kill them, if they think that the diet is going to be too high in fat, because a ketogenic diet contains on average about at least 70 to 80%, depending on the way you construct it, 70 to 80% fat. We're told that that's bad for us. These diets are uniquely healthy, uniquely energizing, uniquely healing for the brain. Everything is upside down and backwards in nutrition science.
Oh, yeah. That is definitely true.
Right?
Yeah.
And you had to figure that out for yourself.
Yeah, and I still butt heads with people in the online nutrition community, if you want to call it that, that think that these ideas are fringe, that it's like, doing harm, and it's just like you get names called. It's really awful.
Yes, I have been there. All you have to do is challenge the mainstream thinking, and
right.
It's a sign that you're doing something right.
Yeah.
That's the way I look at it. Like, we draw fire because we're saying something that goes against the grain, and the only way you're going to change anything is to get people's attention. You've got to wake people up, and you've got to show them how the foods they're eating and the information they have is all wrong.
So true. Well, people listening to this can do their part by sharing this episode with people in their lives that could stand to benefit from it, and really taking this message to heart, because I think, we do have a lot more agency than we've been led to believe.
You have tremendous control over your mental health. I think people that's what I really want people to know, is that we think of mental health as something that just happens to us. Oh, it's our genes, or it's my mother, or it's some trauma, or some very real trauma. It's some mysterious chemical imbalance I'm going to need medication for the rest of my life. But we don't stop to ask, okay, well, what's causing those chemical imbalances in the first place? And so you have tremendous control of your mental health if you have the right information.
Yeah. Well, thank you for putting this book out there. I've got one last question for you. This was a wonderful masterclass. I'm so happy we recorded this in person in particular.
I'm very happy that you invited me. Thank you.
Of course. Where can people pick up your book? Where can they find you on social media?
So the book is available everywhere and being translated into multiple languages as we speak, which I'm really, really grateful for. But if you want to learn more about the book or about these topics in general, or my training program or my clinician directory where you can find people who can help you use a ketogenic diet safely. You should not start a ketogenic diet without consulting with a professional first, because it is a powerful metabolic intervention. So please do not stop your medications and start a ketogenic diet without, talking to somebody first. So there's a clinician directory there too, where you can look for a clinician to help you. All of that's on the website. The website is called diagnosisdiet.com.
Love it. What does living a genius life mean to you?
It means taking good care of my metabolic health, which means sunlight, exercise, fresh air, love, friendship, healthy preoccupations, things that I enjoy doing, like music, and keeping my glucose and insulin levels in a healthy range.
I like it. Do you do music?
I sing and play piano.
That's amazing.
Yeah, no, not amazing, just is.
I love that. That's so cool. Multi-hyphenate. People
need things that, sources of joy in their lives.
I get it. I sing and I play guitar. It's a vital part of my life. I love doing it. Yeah. Well, thanks again for coming out.
Thank you very much for everything that you're doing to help people understand how to eat a brain healthy diet.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.